The last shot in the Hürtgen Forest. The cold gnawed at my bones like a hungry wolf. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the damp, the kind that slithered under your skin and coiled around your lungs. Hürtgen Forest had a way of making a man feel like he'd never been warm in his life. The trees stood like prison bars, stretching up into a sky so gray it looked like the color had drained out of the world. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled, low and mean, a constant reminder that death wasn't far. I gripped my rifle tighter, feeling the damp leather of my gloves stiffen against the metal. My squad was huddled in a shallow trench, carved into the mud like an open wound. We weren't supposed to be here. Hürtgen was a meat grinder, and command knew it. But the brass had their plans, and we had our orders. The Germans weren't giving an inch, and every step we took forward was paid for in blood. We hadn't seen the sun in days. The canopy swallowed it whole, leaving only dim, lifeless light to guide us. Shadows stretched long and twisted, making the trees seem like they were watching. A few days back, we'd lost Jenkins, not to a bullet, not to shrapnel, but to the forest itself. One step too far, and the ground had swallowed him in a sea of mines. The explosion had been quick, but the screaming had lasted much longer. Now we waited. That was the worst part. Not the fighting, not the running, but the waiting. The cold seeped into your mind, made you start thinking about things a man shouldn't be thinking about in a place like this. Home, mostly. A diner in Pennsylvania with warm coffee and a jukebox humming some old tune. A girl's laugh. Things that felt a million miles away. Movement, someone whispered. Every muscle in my body went rigid. I peered through the mist, my breath slow, controlled. The underbrush rustled, just enough to set my nerves on edge. Could have been the wind. Could have been something worse. Then I saw it. A silhouette, shifting between the trees, barely more than a shadow. The others saw it too. No one spoke. We just waited, our fingers tightening around our triggers. A pause. A heartbeat. Then, gunfire exploded into the silence, and the world turned to chaos. The shots tore the tension apart like a blade cutting through taut fabric. The air was filled with sharp sounds, crackling branches, the loose rustle of the ground, the wheezing of the wounded, but most of all, the metallic whistling of bullets as they raced through the thick fog, not making out who they were destined to find. I pressed myself into the ground, feeling the cold mud seep through my clothes, as if the earth itself was trying to pull me into its rotten embrace. Somewhere to my left, a machine gun knocked a piece of bark off a tree, scattering small shavings into the air, and I realized that we had not just been spotted. We were being waited for. This was a trap. Those who had been shouting for an attack were no longer shouting. Dark figures moved between the trunks, elusive as shadows, and each of our shots was answered by something sharp, deadly. For a moment it seemed that they were everywhere, that the forest itself was at war with us, that the roots beneath our feet would come to life and wrap themselves around our bones, leaving us here forever. We tried to answer, but the more we shot, the more the forest absorbed the sounds, as if absorbing each of our shots into its dark, voracious flesh. I saw Thompson, young, almost a boy, with eyes that had known nothing worse than the autumn storms back home in Ohio, rush forward, tripping over something in the darkness. He tried to get up, but a sudden flash of light tore his silhouette apart, and after him came a short, dull sound, like the blow of an axe on a tree. He did not move anymore. I did not hear his groan. I did not hear a word. Only a shadow that bent over him, checked his body, and quickly dissolved into the fog. Suddenly something warm hit my cheek, and I realized it was blood. Not mine. My heart was pounding in my chest. My hands clenched so tightly around the gun that my fingers began to convulse. The shooting was still going on around me, but I could barely hear it anymore. Only the beating of my own pulse somewhere in my ears, in my throat, in my fingertips. Someone from our group was trying to shout, giving orders, but I couldn't make out the words. All I understood was one thing. If I stayed here another moment, if I kept waiting, this night would be my last. I jumped up, pressing against the ground, sliding in the mud, making my way through the branches that cut into my face, as if the forest itself was trying to hold me back. Past the bodies that had been my friend a few minutes ago, past the faces twisted in agony that had perhaps been trying to say something, a word, a second ago. There was no time. Now it all came down to one thing, survival. Suddenly, something flashed ahead, metal, a hand, a look, and without thinking, I pulled the trigger. The shot tore the space between us, and at the same moment something heavy fell, breaking the branches beneath it. I breathed heavily, trying to see who it was, but there was no time, not now. I moved on, gasping for air that was damp and heavy like water. A few shots still rang out behind me, but most had already died down. I knew that if they noticed me, if I made any unnecessary noise, it would be the end of me. I didn't know where I was running to. I didn't know if anyone was still alive or if I was already alone among the dead in this cursed forest. But then I didn't know the main thing. The worst was yet to come. I no longer paid attention to the trees that threatened to fall on me, to the front line that stretched into the distance, to the view that had become gloomy and hopeless. All my attention was on not retreating, not falling to the ground, not becoming another in the meaningless list of the dead that the forest had swallowed without memory. Feelings of hunger and fear began to intertwine, like a strong knot in a rope. I felt so small, so useless in this big, cold world. Every step, every breath became unbearable, and when I noticed how my boots were killing each new centimeter of the ground, I suddenly realized that I was losing control. My head was filled with the noise that had become a constant companion, not just explosions and gunshots, but what remained after them, silence heavy and deaf, which could neither be dispersed nor thrown away. A silence that could not be silenced, because it filled the void left by every sound of war. It seemed as if the entire forest knew about us and was waiting for the moment to swallow us up. If I could describe it, I would say that the forest had a face that was torn apart by pain and anger for every loss, for every name forgotten along with the lives lost. I saw them, these boys, looking at me from their graves, whom I could no longer protect. They had become part of what was left after the explosions, part of this hostile land that no longer knew what compassion was. But I still didn't give up, still believed that maybe I could get out of this. Maybe I could leave this forest behind. I walked, trying to keep myself conscious, because I knew that if I let myself lose control, if I let this darkness swallow me up, I would never get out again. But every step, every breath became more and more difficult. Here and then I saw, if not a person, not a living being, but something more, something weightless that cannot be in this world, something that revolved around me like a dark shadow. It had no eyes, no face, but I felt its gaze. I felt it carefully following my every movement, understanding my every step. It was not just death, it was death itself, following me, looking at my back and waiting. I quickened my pace, not knowing where I was running. The ground shook beneath me, and I no longer understood where the forest ended and my soul began. Suddenly, in all this darkness and fog, I heard it, the sound of a shot. Not quite understanding where I was, I glanced around, trying to understand where it had come from. Another shot, closer this time, but not mine. It was a shot from the other side, and no matter how hard I tried to resist it, I knew this might be my last chance, my last moment to act before the forest swallowed me up. I don't remember when I lost count of the shots, when I stopped knowing where my target was, where my friends were, and where the enemy was. I just knew that if I stayed here, if I didn't move forward, this forest would get me. And even if I died, I would die trying to leave behind some shred of life. I stopped short as I felt blood filling my sleeves. A broken arm, a wounded shoulder, that was the price I paid for that last shot. Gasping for breath, I turned and saw him, a last glimpse of the one who had been waiting for us in the shadows, ready to make his final move before everything changed. And then came the moment I feared most. Not escape, not death, but something that could not be changed. The last shot in the heart of this forest, the last shot that will become a mark for everything that happened to us in these trees, to us who were only part of something bigger and more ruthless. And this moment, this last shot, it was bigger than me. It wasn't just a sound in the forest, not just a bullet fired. It was a sign that there was no going back. The moment when time became slow and heavy, when each second dragged on like a heavy stone rolling on a slippery surface. I even thought I had stopped breathing. My finger was still on the trigger, but even as I let go, I felt all my strength disappear. Every gust of wind, every rustle underfoot, every movement of everything around me seemed so loud, so close. All these sounds rolled over me like waves, and I couldn't stop them. Nothing could be changed. I wasn't just a soldier. I was part of this great and ruthless mechanism of war, where every movement, every shot had its price, its sacrifice. And now that price had fallen on me again. My shoulder ached, and I could feel the blood slowly draining away, involuntarily staining my uniform a dark red. My arm felt heavy as stone, and every step I took seemed so clumsy. I was wounded, but still alive, and that was already a miracle. My head was dizzy with pain, and I could barely make out what was happening around me. But I could see the figure standing in front of me, ready to take his step. The shadow between the trees began to move, as if night and day had once again come together in one place. I tried to feel if it was still my mind, or if maybe I was really standing there, in the heart of this battle. Suddenly, there was another and another. But this one was from ours. I clearly heard the scream that rose from the other side of the forest, and I knew that now this was no longer just a war. It was a race against time. Who could hide the fastest? Who could take a step without making a mistake? We had become prey for the forest, for this land that had long since abandoned us. I looked around, saw a few shadows running through the trees, and heard our soldiers trying to cover us from fire. I was the only one who survived, but was this really a victory? Aren't we all just parts that the forest was absorbing for one great loss? Desperately trying to move on, I felt my legs refuse to obey. They were heavy as lead, and each step on this land seemed even more impossible. Very close, I could hear another of our soldiers fall, and although I could no longer make out who it was, his scream cut through the night. In that moment, I felt the forest take on a life of its own, and maybe I was already a part of this forest, this endless whirlpool of blood and pain that never stopped. Each gust of wind scattered the sounds that became distant, and I felt the fog thicken around me, absorbing my thoughts, my emotions, my soul. I could no longer tell where I ended and where this forest began. The more I moved, the more I understood. I was just another shadow, another wounded person who would not remain in the memory of the living, but would only be part of this endless shadow that intertwined with the darkness and the earth. And in that moment, when everything around me became more and more hazy and unclear, I understood all that was left was one last shot. And it didn't matter if I hit the target. It didn't matter if I could hold out. It was about taking my last step, making the last gesture before the forest itself pulled me into its black embrace, where there would be no more shots, no more pain, no more memories. I took one more step, and as my hand squeezed the trigger again, I heard the last sound that broke the silence that remained in this cursed forest. And at that moment I realized that perhaps this was my last victory. And then I realized, all this time when I ran and hid, when I shot and fell to the ground, it was all just one big illusion, an endless repetition that had no beginning and no end. They said that this was a battle, that it was part of a great war, but in my head there was no longer any room for such concepts. All that was in front of me was only darkness, silent and hostile, swallowing up all life. I stood there among the wet trees and dead shadows, and the earth around me already seemed alien. Its smell was like gunpowder and blood, like moisture and dampness, something that cannot be erased, something that will remain in memory forever. Breathless, I took another step forward, but my legs could no longer hold me. I felt my eyes begin to darken, my consciousness slowly evaporate along with my blood, which was still slowly flowing from the wound. At that moment, I realized that I could no longer fight. I was no longer a soldier. I was just another part of this great, endless mechanism that devours all life, all dreams, all hopes. But even in this, even in my last despair, when I felt the strength leave my body, I heard something. I heard someone approaching me. At first, it was just a faint rustle, but then I heard clear footsteps approaching. It was someone with their own path, with the same pain, with the same shadows that had haunted me from the very beginning. I realized that in this forest, there were neither enemies nor allies. We were all just puppets in the hands of this land, this war that did not distinguish us from each other. And here he was, the one who came, interrupted my thoughts, and brought me to reality. He was one of us, one of the survivors, and like me, he was walking through this terrible forest, no longer hoping for rescue. His face was blurred by pain, by what he had experienced, by what he had left behind. But in his eyes, I saw something I never wanted to see: fear. Not of what was around him, but of what was inside him. The same fear that must have haunted me now. He approached me, paused for a moment, looking at my wounded body. We were both silent, unable to find words for this moment. And then he, like me, did something that could not be undone. He pulled out his gun, and in that second I understood. We were all part of this battle until the end, even if it meant that we no longer seemed to have control over anything. We stood there, staring at each other, like two souls lost in the dark, not knowing where one began and the other ended. And even though this moment was the last for both of us, I didn't feel like we would be left in it. We were just parts of this forest, this place where the war never stopped or ended. I heard the last sound. It wasn't a shot. It was silence. And I realized that this must be the end. Not in the shots, not in the battle, not in the death, but in this silence that remained after everything. A silence that swallowed up all the sounds, all the memories, everything we had ever known. And that silence was the end. Yes, it was the end. Not just the end of my story or this particular battle, but the end of everything we had known. The end of what could once have been our concept of life. The end of those moments when there were still hopes and dreams. It was more than just the end of a stage. It was a break with what was left behind, with all the people we had once loved, with those we would never see again. And even after that, after the last shot and the last shadow that swallowed us, I felt that only this was left, an emptiness filled with silence that had no beginning and no end. Everyone who has survived the Hürtgen Forest carries this silence within them, and perhaps will never be able to forget it, will never be able to leave it behind. It wasn't just about war. It was about what a person can endure and then lose within themselves, as a part of themselves. It was a real end, and there was no longer a question of what next. The forest left everything behind, and we became part of this fog that will never dissipate.